I don't actually represent anyone anymore. I'm in the sad position of being retired, but I'm down here as representing the International Council on Archives, which I do every 6 months or so. I'm here to talk about the impact of copyright on archives and really to respond to what you've heard from the IPO and some of what you haven't heard from the IPO, actually. I think archivists are scared by copyright, which I think is sad but not surprising. It's largely because it's unfamiliar to them. I mean, if you go on an archives course at one of the universities, you're likely to have a talk from me on copyright, which will take 2 hours, and that's the only information you'll get about copyright at all in your professional training. I think also archivists are scared because, frankly, in my view, in many respects, copyright's rather absurd. I mean, my biggest feeling of absurdity about copyright is duration. So I'm going to say something about duration, even though Robin and Nick haven't said anything about it at all. We've been told, and we keep being told, that the purpose of copyright is to encourage innovation, to encourage creativity. And yet we have a duration of copyright, which is the standard of which is 70 years from the death of the creator. So why you are giving benefits to the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren of the creator in order to encourage innovation, I really don't understand. Which makes the 2039 date for the termination of copyright in unpublished literary works and some other works even more absurd. And so, which means that 15th century works and things are protected by copyright, even though they weren't when copyright was created in 1709. I find it really bizarre. However, I hope you are aware that the Enterprise and Regulatory Reform Bill has given the government power to remove at least some of the 2039 terms. And so when that happens, on the assumption that it does happen in a year or so, huge volumes of copyright material in archives will cease to be protected by copyright altogether. Most 19th century material and all pre-19th century material will cease to be protected by copyright. And I think that would be a wonderful thing myself. We don't actually know yet how it's going to happen or precisely when it's going to happen, but I am assured that it will happen. So it's something to look forward to and something to keep your eyes open for. And it will definitely remove at least one of the, or part of the absurdity of the duration of copyright. I don't want to spend too long because we need to give you time to ask questions. So I'll just say a few things about the other changes to copyright. Preservation copying, I think, and indeed copying by librarians and archivists for users, applying to all types of work is a huge improvement. I have to say that preservation copying of things like artistic works and sound recordings and films has almost certainly been happening anyway in archives across the country. I'd be amazed if it hasn't. It'll just be nice that it will in future be legitimate. I think you need to be aware, though, that the purpose of the preservation copying exception is preservation. The purpose is not to make the material available online. So even though you're making a digital copy, the purpose of the preservation copy is preservation. You need another exception to make that digital copy available remotely, or you need permission. Copying of unpublished works by in archives for users, once again, applying to all types of work will be hugely beneficial. In fact, a vital change. Once again, I'm absolutely sure that archives all across the country have been copying photographs, for example, for users, and maps and so on, quite regardless of the fact they're not allowed to. And I think even some of them have probably been getting declaration forms for these types of copy. But once again, it will be jolly nice if it can be done legitimately. I think it's worth understanding the implications of the removal of the regulations, the wonderfully named Copyright Librarians and Archivists Copying of Copyright Material Regulations 1989, with 2 sets of brackets. I think it's a splendid name. Anyway, they're going to be abolished, but that means that the declaration form that we all know and love is also going to be abolished. There will no longer be a statutory declaration form. The declaration will simply be something that is in writing. So you can receive a declaration in a letter or in an email from someone. You don't have to receive a particular form. And that will make life a great deal easier. We've been told about the copying of published works. At the moment, you might not actually be aware that there is no exception which allows you to copy the manuscript of a published work. If you have in your archive a manuscript of a work which has been published, it's a published work itself. The trouble is, it's not actually covered by either of the copying exceptions, because the librarian's exception applies to published editions of works, and the archivist's exception applies to unpublished works. So there is no exception which allows the copying of a manuscript of a published work. There will be in the future, and I think it's terribly important, and I hope the IPO has taken this on board already because I've told them before. It's terribly important that that the exception for published works applies to archivists as well as librarians, because archivists have responsibility for a great many published works. I mean, there are lots of maps, there are lots of photographs, and there are lots of manuscripts of published works in archives. So it's terribly important that you have access to this exception. You've heard about the new exception for online access to material on the premises. The current draft of the regulations, as they have been published for consultation, is actually a little bit strange, because Robin said that it's based on the Information Society Directive, and yet it interpolates or adds in a little bit, which is that the use must be for non-commercial research or private study, which actually is not in the directive. And I personally would say that archivists would find it extremely difficult to police any use of an access system on their premises which was limited to non-commercial research or private study. Fair enough supplying copies for those purposes, but actually controlling access simply to read material, I think would be virtually impossible. And then we were told a little bit about folk songs and funny things like that. This is another one of those absurdities, in my view, of copyright, saying that you can have a copyright in a folk song when you have no idea who created the work or how long ago it was created. I think it's a bit difficult to say that there is a rights owner in a folk song, and actually folk material has been the source of huge creativity. If you think of someone like Vaughan Williams or someone like the Brothers Grimm, they produce new works based on folk material, and if they couldn't have done that, then we wouldn't have a lot of wonderful modern works. And I shall say just a few words about orphan works. We have two wonderful new schemes for orphan works, one from the European Union and one from the UK government. Frankly, I think neither of them will be of a great deal of use to archivists. I think they will be extremely valuable to individual researchers who want to get permission for or have license or an exception to use a relatively small number of works. But if you're talking about 1,000 works or 10,000 works or 100,000 works, and the regulations will require you to do a diligent search for the rights owner of every single one, I don't see how the orphan works exceptions will be very useful to archivists. So I personally expect risk management to become more and more important, which makes this conference all the more useful. And I'm looking forward to hearing, again, Peter's talk later on about management of risk, because I've heard him talk about it before. And just finally, just one or two words about the international scheme, since I'm here as representing the IPO. I represent the IPO in Geneva at meetings of the World Intellectual Property Organization, which is contemplating a treaty, an international treaty on exceptions to copyright in favor of libraries and archives. It's not impossible that we'll get a treaty, and it would be extraordinary and wonderful if we did. And the purpose of such a thing primarily is to improve international dealings in copyright materials, so that, for example, an exception in one country applies in another country, so you can transfer a copy to another country. But it'll be a long time before we get that treaty. Thank you.